27-year-old Alison Botha and her friends had spent the day having a great time relaxing and soaking up the sun down at the beach near her hometown of Port Arthur in South Africa. They had a fantastic day, but as the sun was getting lower and lower on the horizon, the group decided it was time to pack up and head over to Alison's house, where they would eat some dinner and visit for a bit longer before calling it a night. Once dinner was over and it started getting later, slowly, Alison's friends started to trickle out the door and head home, leaving only a few of her friends left who didn't have a ride of their own. They told Alison that they would just walk home, but Alison wasn't having any of that. She insisted that her friends needed to get home safe, so Alison grabbed her keys before they all headed outside. After that, Alison locked up her home and then they all went to pile into Alison's car, which was parked just out front of her building. Just after 3 a.m. that same night, Alison, now all alone in her empty car, pulled up in front of her house, looking to park her car in the same place she had it parked before they had all left. But, to her dismay, that spot had been taken, and looking around, she could see that there weren't any open spaces nearby either. So, without any other option, Alison drove her car further away than she would have liked and parked in the nearest parking space she could find. Once she had pulled her car into the parking space and moved her shifter into the park position, Alison was startled when her driver's side door all of a sudden swung open, and within an instant there was someone there holding a knife to her throat. Alison didn't move. She was frozen in her seat when the man holding the knife to her throat told her to slide over into the passenger seat, and without question, Alison did what she was told. As soon as the driver's seat was empty, the man quickly got in, closed the door, and drove Alison's car away with her still sitting in the passenger seat next to him. Frozen with fear, Alison didn't say anything. As they drove down the dark streets, this strange man eventually broke the silence. He told Alison his name was Charlie. Looking over at her, he gave her a quick smile and told her that he just needed to borrow her car for a little while, and if she cooperated with him and didn't cause any trouble, then he would let her go. Alison desperately wanted to get away from this man, so she resigned herself to cooperating with him in the hopes that everything would be okay. But that all changed when Charlie pulled over to the side of the road. Alison heard the back door of her car open. Then she could feel the car jostle around a little bit as someone climbed into the back seat. And then shortly after that, she heard the door shut again. Charlie didn't say anything as he pulled away from the curb and started driving the car towards the edge of town. As soon as the third person entered the car, Alison could sense the tension growing inside the vehicle, and it terrified her. Her mind was racing, and as she was sitting there, her eyes darted around the car, trying to make sense of what was going on. And when her eyes accidentally scanned across the rearview mirror, what she seen made her heart drop into her stomach. Staring back at her was another man, but this man did not look friendly at all. He looked angry, he looked cold, and he looked mean. Alison quickly looked out her passenger side window and sunk further into her seat as they left the city and its lights behind, and they drove into the darkness of the countryside. 26-year-old Franz Dutoit was a married man and a father who had a lengthy criminal history. He was known around town and amongst the people who knew him as a violent and unpredictable person who enjoyed carrying out violent attacks against people, but most notably, against women in particular. While he had been accused of multiple sex offenses against multiple women on many occasions, he had always gotten off without any charges, receiving nothing more than a slap on the wrist because his own father was a police officer. Franz Dutoit did have a reputation as a sex offender though, and in addition to his violent attacks against women, he also had a history of arson. This offense was added to his resume when he set a school on fire. Franz had a hard time living by the rules and following the laws. He did not like being restricted by societal norms, and his penchant for going against the grain led him to a woman with similar values, who he became romantically involved with. This woman identified herself as a dark witch, and as a result of their relationship, Franz decided to declare himself as a disciple of Satan. His accomplice, 19-year-old Thunes Kruger, also identified himself as a disciple of Satan. But unlike Franz, Thunes had grown up poor, and his home life was allegedly very abusive. His father was the complete polar opposite of Franz's father. Rather than being a police officer, he was a career criminal who had been in and out of prison throughout the majority of Thunes' childhood. Franz was an absolutely delusional man. He believed he was incredibly desirable and had a way with women. But Thunes didn't fool himself into believing anything like that. Thunes knew he was not attractive, and he was not the smartest guy either. He was the type of guy that most women stayed away from. Over time, the way women reacted to him made him start to resent the women who rejected him, and eventually he began to resent women altogether. Thunes was now to the point where he hated women, but was still sexually attracted to them. And so this combination culminated into something evil. Alison felt the car slow down as it pulled into a remote area just off of the highway outside of the city. Satisfied with the level of seclusion the area provided, Charlie brought the car to a stop and told Alison to get out. Once out of the car, the two men stood there for a moment, looking at Alison, chuckling to one another. Then they turned to Alison and told her what they intended to do to her. They told her that they were going to take advantage of her. Alison's heart was in her stomach when Charlie asked her if she planned on putting up a fight. Remembering what he had told her earlier, that if she cooperated, then she would be set free, Alison told Charlie that she would not resist the assault. Seemingly satisfied with her answer, both men proceeded to take turns assaulting Alison. And after what seemed like hours, the two men finally stood up and got themselves dressed while Alison lay on the ground naked. Then they turned to Alison, and together they held her down and viciously stabbed her in the abdomen 37 times. The sick truth was that even though Charlie had given Alison hope that she would survive the night, they knew they were never going to let Alison go. They had decided long before they had abducted her that the next victim would never be given the chance to go to the police. The two men stood around Alison as she lay on the ground waiting for her to die, believing she would be dead any moment. But after a while, they were surprised to see that she was still breathing. Charlie was tired of standing around waiting for her to die, and so he took the knife, bent down over top of Alison, and proceeded to slash her throat a minimum of 16 times. While he was cutting her throat, Alison was wide awake and fully aware that her throat was being slit repeatedly as his arm moved back and forth in front of her face. He slashed her throat so deeply that she was almost decapitated. After that, they left Alison for dead. They knew her injuries were so bad that she would be dead any minute, so they dropped their fake names and started to refer to one another by their real names. Charlie was actually Franz Dutoit, and his accomplice was Thunes Kruger. They took one last look at Alison before they hopped back into her car and drove away, leaving her there on the ground. Alison, believing that this was the end, made one last attempt to at least identify who was responsible for her death. After they drove away, she wrote their names in the sand and then fell unconscious. A little while later, Alison's eyes flickered open. She didn't know how long she had been laying there, but however long it was, she hadn't died yet. As she lay there, and the reality of this situation came flooding back to her, she realized that she wasn't ready to give up. If she hadn't died yet, then maybe she should fight to live. Alison, very slowly and very painfully, struggled to her feet. Staggering to maintain her balance, once she was standing, she tried to see down the road in the direction of where she needed to go. But as she looked in the direction of the highway, she realized that something was wrong. She wasn't able to move her head properly. It was as though she didn't have control over how it moved. And as she reached her hand up to her neck to figure out what the issue was, her fingers came to rest on the wide open slit across her throat. Her neck muscles had been slashed so badly that she was no longer able to support her head anymore or move it around like she normally would have. Alison reached up and used her hand to hold her head up so that she could see where she was going. Then, when she went to take her first step, she felt wetness on her feet. Looking down at the ground where her feet were, she was horrified to see what was causing this wet feeling. Alison was staring down at her own intestines that were hanging outside of her belly. The 37 stab wounds to her abdomen area had left a wide open hole in her body, and her insides were now falling out. Alison needed to come up with a plan. Looking around, she seen that her clothes were still there, so she took her shirt and spread it out. Then she gathered up her intestines and laid them in the shirt, making a sort of bundle that she could carry close to her body. Now that she had herself gathered up, she stood up again. Carrying her insides in her shirt close to her body and holding her head upright, she began her long and arduous trek to the highway where hopefully she would find help. Whether it was by sheer will to live or by divine intervention, Alison managed to struggle her way to the highway where she collapsed on the side of the road. It was the middle of the night, and the chances of there being any traffic was slim. But as she lay there for what seemed like hours, but was probably more like minutes, she finally seen headlights coming towards her. She was so hopeful when the car started to slow down beside her, but when the car came to a stop where she was laying, the driver took one look at Alison and immediately sped away without offering any help, leaving her in her broken state on the side of the road all alone. But only a few moments later, another vehicle came down the road, and this time it came to a stop. And then, the next thing Alison knew, there was a buzz of activity going on around her. People were frantically talking on the phone, calling for an ambulance, and trying to talk with Alison as they took in the magnitude of what they had come across. The driver of the car, 20-year-old Tian, stayed with Alison while they waited for the ambulance to arrive. When it did, 45 minutes later, the paramedics jumped out and rushed to treat Alison. But when they seen her and the enormity of her injuries, they really didn't think there was much chance of survival. But they loaded her into the ambulance and rushed her to the hospital, where she was taken into surgery immediately. During the surgery, the doctors were amazed to find that not a single one of the stab wounds inflicted on Alison's body had hit an artery or any major organs. Additionally, when Alison was being assaulted, the men had choked Alison so ferociously that she had passed out, causing her to lose control of her bowels. The doctor said that if she hadn't done that, then her body would have become septic, and the chances of survival would have been even slimmer. After the surgery, Alison was wheeled into a private room where she was left to recover under the supervision of the medical staff. But there was another pressing issue. The police needed to find who did this to Alison. And since Alison was alive and recovering, she was more than ready to tell them who had done this to her. The police showed her photos of known criminals, and Alison easily pointed out Franz Dutoit and Thunes Kruger. She then provided a written account of what happened. The police were familiar with both men and had absolutely no problem finding and arresting them. Alison stood behind a one-way mirror so that they couldn't see her when she picked them out of the lineup. Franz and Thunes were charged with kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder, and on August 7th of 1995, they were both sentenced to life in prison. The presiding judge stated that neither one of them will ever see the light of day again, but to Alison's dismay, 28 years later, in July of 2023, both men were released from prison on parole. Alison made a full recovery and is thriving today. However, she is devastated by the release of her two attackers. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed this video, then I would say subscribe. Maybe even hit that like button and click all of the notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. And I will see you again later.